My name is Diana Maxwell, and I'm about to tell you the story of how a budget cut taught my director a lesson he'll never forget. At 34, I'd spent the last 8 years as a senior network infrastructure specialist at Meridian Technologies, a mid-sized consulting firm that somehow managed to survive on systems held together with digital duct tape and prayers. The company occupied a gleaming downtown office building, but our IT department was relegated to the basement levels where the real work happened. The server room hummed with the constant drone of overworked cooling systems. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead like dying stars, and the air carried that distinctive mixture of ozone and desperation that every tech professional knows intimately. My workspace was a cluttered desk surrounded by towers of documentation, emergency manuals, and enough backup drives to stock a small electronics store. The walls were lined with monitoring screens displaying network traffic patterns, system health metrics, and an alarming number of warning indicators that had become so routine we'd stopped noticing them. This was where I spent most of my days, nursing ancient servers through their daily crises and performing the digital equivalent of heart surgery on systems that should have been retired years ago. Working alongside me was a small but dedicated team of specialists who'd learned to find dark humor in our perpetual state of technical crisis. Marcus Chen handled database administration with the weary expertise of someone who'd spent too many nights manually reconstructing corrupted data tables. His desk was a monument to caffeine consumption, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and coffee cups that had achieved their own ecosystem. Marcus had the unsettling ability to predict system failures 3 days in advance, a skill that management consistently ignored until disaster struck. Jennifer Walsh managed our security protocols with the grim determination of someone fighting a losing battle against increasingly sophisticated threats. Her corner of the basement resembled a war room, with multiple monitors displaying intrusion detection alerts, vulnerability scans, and a constantly updated threat matrix that painted an increasingly dire picture of our digital defenses. Jennifer had the unfortunate habit of being right about security risks, which made her deeply unpopular with the executive team who preferred to believe that their decade-old firewalls were sufficient protection. Tommy Rodriguez rounded out our core team as the junior systems administrator, full of enthusiasm and armed with fresh certifications that meant absolutely nothing in the face of our Frankenstein infrastructure. Tommy believed that every problem had a solution, every system could be optimized, and every crash was just an opportunity to learn something new. His optimism was both refreshing and heartbreaking, like watching someone discover that Santa Claus isn't real while simultaneously learning that the Easter Bunny is actually a debt collector. Above us, literally and figuratively, sat Director James Sullivan in his corner office on the 15th floor. Sullivan had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of political maneuvering and an uncanny ability to take credit for successes while deflecting blame for failures. His office was a shrine to management buzzwords and motivational posters, featuring a stunning view of the city skyline that he probably appreciated more than the technical infrastructure that kept the company running. Sullivan's management philosophy could be summarized as cut costs, increase efficiency, and assume that technology will somehow solve problems through sheer willpower. The man had no technical background beyond a basic understanding of Microsoft Office, but he'd somehow convinced the executive team that running IT was simply a matter of applying business principles to computer problems. He treated our department budget like a personal challenge, constantly seeking ways to trim expenses while maintaining the illusion of improved performance. Sullivan's favorite phrases included, "do more with less," "think outside the box," and "leverage synergies," each delivered with the confidence of someone who had never actually tried to restore a corrupted database at 3 a.m. Our relationship had always been strained, built on mutual distrust and fundamentally different approaches to problem solving. I believed in preventive maintenance, proper training, and investing in infrastructure before crisis struck. Sullivan believed in reactive solutions, cost-cutting measures, and the magical power of employee motivation to overcome technical limitations. These philosophies had clashed repeatedly over the years, creating a professional tension that simmered just below the surface of our departmental meetings. The breaking point came in early March when I submitted a budget proposal that would change everything. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive training request focused on advanced cloud migration and disaster recovery techniques. The proposal totaled $22,000 and included certification programs for the entire team, hands-on workshops with industry experts, and access to cutting-edge simulation environments where we could practice complex recovery scenarios without risking our production systems. The documentation was meticulous, running to 47 pages of detailed analysis, cost-benefit calculations, and risk assessments. I'd included case studies from similar companies, testimonials from industry professionals, and a timeline showing how the training would immediately improve our response capabilities. The return on investment was crystal clear. The cost of the training would be recovered within 6 months through improved system uptime, reduced emergency contractor fees, and the ability to handle complex migrations without external assistance. More importantly, the training addressed a critical gap in our capabilities. Our current infrastructure was a patchwork of legacy systems, cloud services, and hybrid solutions that required specialized knowledge to manage effectively. When things went wrong, as they inevitably did, we were often forced to rely on expensive consultants or hope that our outdated documentation would provide sufficient guidance. The proposed training would give us the expertise to handle these situations internally, reducing both costs and response times. I submitted the proposal through official channels, including detailed supporting documentation and a formal presentation that I'd practiced until I could deliver it in my sleep. The request went to Sullivan's office with a copy to the department head and a courtesy notification to the finance team. I followed up with a brief email highlighting the key points and requesting a meeting to discuss implementation details. Sullivan's response was predictable in its complete lack of response. Days passed without acknowledgement. Then, weeks. I sent follow-up emails that disappeared into the digital void of his inbox. The training deadline approached with bureaucratic indifference, and I found myself checking my messages obsessively for any sign that the proposal was being considered. Finally, exactly 3 days before the registration deadline, Sullivan called me into his office. The meeting was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, that magical time when executives delivered bad news while mentally preparing for their weekend golf games. I climbed the 14 floors to his corner office, carrying a folder with additional supporting documents and a carefully rehearsed argument for why the training was essential. Sullivan's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who considered himself a visionary leader. The walls were covered with framed certificates, motivational quotes, and photographs of him shaking hands with various executives at corporate events. His desk was a monument to organized inefficiency, with neat stacks of papers that looked important but probably hadn't been touched in weeks. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while his computer screen displayed what appeared to be a golf course booking website. He gestured for me to sit in one of the uncomfortable leather chairs facing his desk, the kind of seating that was designed to make visitors feel small and slightly off balance. Sullivan leaned back in his executive chair, fingers steepled in a pose that he'd probably learned from a leadership seminar, and delivered his verdict with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "Diana, I've reviewed your training proposal, and I'm afraid we can't approve it at this time. The budget allocation for professional development has been significantly reduced this quarter, and we need to focus our resources on more immediate operational needs. I'm sure you understand that in today's economic climate, we have to make difficult decisions about non-essential expenses." The words hit me like a physical blow. Non-essential expenses. After 3 weeks of preparation, detailed analysis, and clear demonstration of value, my proposal had been dismissed as non-essential. I felt my carefully constructed professional demeanor beginning to crack. But years of corporate survival had taught me to maintain composure even in the face of spectacular stupidity. "I understand budget constraints," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "However, I'd like to emphasize that this training directly addresses critical gaps in our disaster recovery capabilities. The cost of the program would be recovered within 6 months through improved efficiency and reduced consultant fees." Sullivan waved his hand dismissively, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both condescension and complete disinterest. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Diana, but we need to be realistic about our priorities. Your team has been handling these situations for years without specialized training. I'm confident that your existing expertise and natural problem-solving abilities will be sufficient to address any challenges that arise. Natural problem-solving abilities. I stared at him for a moment, wondering if he truly believed that technical expertise was some kind of innate talent that didn't require ongoing development. In Sullivan's world, apparently, managing complex IT infrastructure was like riding a bicycle. Once you learned the basics, you never needed to improve or adapt to new technologies. Director Sullivan, I said, choosing my words carefully. I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You're declining the training request because you believe our current skill set is adequate for handling advanced cloud migration and disaster recovery scenarios? Exactly, he replied with the satisfied smile of someone who believed he'd made a brilliant executive decision. I have complete confidence in your team's ability to rise to any challenge. That's what we pay you for, to find solutions and make things work, regardless of the circumstances. I nodded slowly, making a mental note of his exact words. I'd like to document this conversation for our records. Would you prefer I send a follow-up email summarizing your decision? Or would you like to provide a written response to the original proposal? Sullivan's expression shifted slightly, perhaps sensing that something was different about my tone. A brief email summary would be fine, nothing too formal, just a quick note confirming that we've discussed the matter and decided to postpone the training pending future budget availability. Of course, I replied, already composing the email in my mind. I'll send that summary within the hour, along with a notation that the decision was made despite the detailed risk analysis and ROI projections included in the original proposal. I stood up and shook his hand, maintaining eye contact just long enough to let him know that I understood exactly what had just happened. As I walked toward the door, Sullivan called out with the false cheerfulness of someone trying to smooth over an awkward situation. Diana, I hope you understand that this isn't a reflection on your work or your team's capabilities. Sometimes we have to make tough choices, and I'm confident that you'll continue to deliver excellent results regardless of these temporary budget constraints. I paused at the door and turned back with a smile that probably looked more predatory than reassuring. Don't worry, Director Sullivan. I completely understand your position, and I want to assure you that my team will handle any situation that arises with exactly the level of expertise we currently possess. That evening, I sat in my home office composing the most carefully worded email of my career. Every sentence was crafted to be professional, respectful, and absolutely devastating in its implications. I documented Sullivan's exact words, referenced the specific training components that had been rejected, and included subtle reminders about the risk factors I'd identified in the original proposal. The email was copied to the appropriate department heads, archived in multiple locations, and sent with a read receipt that would confirm when Sullivan had reviewed the contents. I also printed a hard copy for my files and saved digital backups on 3 separate systems. In the corporate world, documentation is both sword and shield, and I intended to be prepared for whatever came next. Over the following weeks, I began preparing for what I knew was inevitable. Our infrastructure was held together by expertise, experience, and an alarming amount of luck. The training I'd requested would have provided the advanced skills needed to handle complex recovery scenarios. But Sullivan's decision meant we'd be facing future crises with our current capabilities. I started documenting everything with obsessive detail. Every system vulnerability, every potential failure point, every gap in our disaster recovery procedures was carefully cataloged and cross-referenced. I created a comprehensive database of our technical limitations, including specific examples of situations where advanced training would be critical for successful resolution. Marcus noticed my increased focus on documentation and asked about it during one of our late-night troubleshooting sessions. Diana, are you building a case study or preparing for Armageddon? I looked up from my laptop, where I was updating a detailed timeline of recent system issues. Maybe both. I have a feeling that our current approach to infrastructure management is about to be tested in ways that Sullivan doesn't fully appreciate. Jennifer overheard the conversation and walked over to my desk, carrying a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. You know something's coming, don't you? Your disaster face has been getting more pronounced lately. My disaster face? That expression you get when you're analyzing multiple failure scenarios simultaneously. It's like watching someone play three-dimensional chess while calculating the trajectory of falling meteors. I had to admit that Jennifer's observation was accurate. The combination of outdated infrastructure, limited training, and budget constraints had created a perfect storm of potential failures. I wasn't predicting disaster so much as calculating the probability of various catastrophic scenarios. Tommy, who had been quietly monitoring server performance at his workstation, looked up with the expression of someone who'd just discovered an unpleasant truth. Are we expecting something specific to happen, or is this just general preparation? Let's call it professional vigilance, I replied. Our systems are complex, our documentation is incomplete, and our training budget has been eliminated. Those factors tend to create interesting challenges that require creative solutions. What I didn't tell them was that I'd already begun exploring other employment opportunities. The budget rejection had been a clear signal that Sullivan's management philosophy was fundamentally incompatible with effective IT operations. I'd started networking with industry contacts, updating my resume, and quietly researching companies that understood the value of technical expertise. The first warning sign came on a Tuesday morning in late April. I arrived at work to find Marcus already at his desk, staring at his monitor with the expression of someone who'd discovered a gas leak in a fireworks factory. His screen displayed a cascade of database alerts, each one more alarming than the last. "We have a situation," he said without looking up. "The primary database server is showing signs of corruption in the transaction logs. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the error rates are climbing exponentially." I pulled up the system monitoring dashboard and immediately saw the problem. The database server, an aging machine that had been scheduled for replacement 3 years ago, was finally showing signs of serious hardware failure. The transaction logs were becoming corrupted at an increasing rate, creating data integrity issues that would eventually cascade throughout the entire system. "How long do we have before this becomes critical?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. Marcus ran a diagnostic script and analyzed the results with the grim efficiency of someone who'd seen this scenario before. Based on the current failure rate, we're looking at complete system failure within 72 hours, maybe less if the corruption spreads to the primary data tables. Jennifer walked over to investigate the commotion and immediately understood the implications. "Do we have a current backup of the transaction logs?" "We have backups, but they're not designed for this type of corruption," Marcus replied. "The standard recovery procedures assume isolated failures, not progressive data degradation. We'd need specialized recovery techniques to salvage the corrupted data without losing critical transaction history." I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. This was exactly the type of scenario that the rejected training would have addressed. Advanced database recovery techniques, specialized corruption repair tools, and detailed procedures for handling complex data integrity issues. Without that training, we were reduced to hoping that our standard procedures would work and praying that the corruption didn't spread faster than we could contain it. "What are our options?" Tommy asked, already pulling up technical documentation that I knew would be inadequate for the current situation. "We can try standard recovery procedures," I said. "But our success rate with this type of corruption is probably around 30%. The alternative is to bring in specialized consultants who have the advanced training to handle complex database recovery." "How much would consultants cost?" Jennifer asked. I did a quick mental calculation based on previous emergency contracts. "Probably around $50,000 for a complete recovery, assuming they can resolve the corruption without data loss. If we lose significant transaction history, the cost could be much higher." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The training that Sullivan had rejected as non-essential would have cost $22,000 and provided the expertise needed to handle this situation internally. Instead, We were facing consultant fees that would be more than double that amount, along with the risk of significant data loss and extended system downtime. I spent the next hour implementing temporary patches and monitoring systems, trying to slow the corruption spread while we developed a comprehensive response plan. The situation was stable but deteriorating, like trying to stop a leak in a dam by plugging holes with increasingly inadequate materials. At 11:30 a.m., I made the call that would change everything. I picked up the phone and dialed Sullivan's extension, preparing to deliver news that would shatter his comfortable belief that technical problems could be solved through determination and positive thinking. Director Sullivan, this is Diana Maxwell. We have a critical situation developing with the primary database server that requires immediate attention and significant financial resources to resolve. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of papers being shuffled. What kind of situation, Diana? And please keep it brief. I have a meeting with the executive team in 10 minutes. I took a deep breath and delivered the news with clinical precision. We're experiencing progressive data corruption in the transaction logs that will result in complete system failure within 72 hours. Standard recovery procedures are insufficient for this type of corruption. We need to bring in specialized consultants immediately, at an estimated cost of $50,000, or risk losing significant transaction history and facing extended system downtime. The silence that followed was so complete that I briefly wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Sullivan's voice came through the speaker with a tone that suggested he was still processing the information. $50,000 for database consultants. Isn't this exactly the type of situation that your team is supposed to handle? Yes, I replied. It is exactly the type of situation we're supposed to handle. However, as I outlined in my training proposal, we lack the specialized skills needed for advanced database recovery. The training would have provided those capabilities at a cost of $22,000. Another pause. Longer this time. I could almost hear the mental calculations taking place as Sullivan realized the implications of his budget decision. Diana, I need you to exhaust all internal options before we consider external consultants. I'm confident that your team can find a solution if you approach the problem creatively. I understand your position, I said, making sure my tone remained professional and respectful. However, I want to make sure you understand the risks involved. Our internal capabilities have approximately a 30% success rate with this type of corruption. If we fail, we could lose months of transaction history and face extended system downtime that would be far more expensive than the consultant fees. I appreciate your concern, but I have confidence in your team's ability to rise to this challenge. Please proceed with internal recovery procedures and keep me updated on your progress. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a moment, marveling at Sullivan's ability to ignore reality even when it was explained in simple, direct terms. He'd essentially ordered us to attempt a technical procedure that we weren't properly trained to perform, with a 70% chance of failure, in order to avoid spending money on the expertise that would ensure success. Marcus had been listening to the conversation and shook his head in disbelief. He wants us to wing it with a $50,000 database recovery? Apparently, he believes that our natural problem-solving abilities will overcome the lack of specialized training. I replied, we're going to document everything, follow our standard procedures, and hope for the best. Jennifer looked up from her security monitoring station with an expression that suggested she'd just witnessed something profoundly stupid. Are we actually going to attempt this without proper training? We're going to follow Sullivan's direct orders, I said, and document every step of the process. If we succeed, great. If we fail, we'll have a complete record of exactly why we failed and what resources would have prevented the failure. The next 60 hours were a masterclass in controlled chaos. We implemented our standard database recovery procedures with meticulous attention to detail, documenting every command, every result, and every indication that our approach was inadequate for the situation. The corruption continued to spread despite our efforts, consuming data at an accelerating rate that our patches couldn't contain. I maintained constant communication with Sullivan, providing hourly updates on our progress and the deteriorating situation. Each conversation followed the same pattern. I would report that our internal procedures were proving insufficient, and he would respond with encouragement to think outside the box and find creative solutions. By Thursday afternoon, the situation had become critical. The database corruption had spread to core system tables, and we were facing imminent total failure. I made one final call to Sullivan's office, delivering the news that would force him to confront the consequences of his decisions. Director Sullivan, I need to inform you that our internal recovery procedures have been unsuccessful. The database corruption has spread to critical system tables, and we're now facing complete system failure within 6 hours. We need to bring in emergency consultants immediately, or we will lose the entire database. The response was immediate and explosive. This is unacceptable. Diana, I gave you explicit instructions to handle this situation internally. How can you tell me that your team can't perform basic database recovery? Because basic database recovery procedures are insufficient for this type of corruption, I replied with the patience of someone explaining fire safety to an arsonist. As I documented in my training proposal, we lack the specialized skills needed for advanced database recovery. The consultants we need have those skills because they've received the training that was rejected as non-essential. There was a moment of stunned silence as the implications sank in. Sullivan was apparently experiencing the unique horror of realizing that his cost-cutting measures had created a crisis that would cost far more than the original investment would have prevented. Get the consultants, he said finally. Whatever it costs, just get them here immediately. I'll contact our emergency database recovery service, I said. However, I should mention that emergency consultants charge premium rates. The cost will likely be closer to $75,000, and there's no guarantee that they can recover all the corrupted data. I spent the next 4 hours coordinating with emergency consultants while our systems gradually collapsed around us. The database failure triggered cascade failures in dependent systems, creating a domino effect that brought down our entire network infrastructure. Email systems crashed, client portals went offline, and internal applications became inaccessible. The consultants arrived at 8 p.m. with specialized equipment and expertise that our internal team lacked. They immediately identified the specific type of corruption we were dealing with and began implementing recovery procedures that were far more sophisticated than anything we'd attempted. Within 2 hours, they had the situation stabilized and were beginning the slow process of data reconstruction. Sullivan arrived at the office around 10 p.m., looking like someone who'd just discovered that his house was on fire while he was at a dinner party. He surveyed the chaos in the basement server room with the expression of someone witnessing a natural disaster that he'd accidentally caused. How bad is it? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. The consultants have stabilized the situation and are beginning data recovery, I replied. However, we've lost approximately 18 hours of transaction history, and full system restoration will take another 12 hours. The total cost will be around $85,000 in consultant fees, plus the cost of system downtime and lost productivity. Sullivan's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from disbelief to resignation. $85,000 for something that should have been handled internally? For something that would have been handled internally if we'd had the proper training, I corrected. The training that was rejected as non-essential 3 weeks ago. I pulled out my carefully prepared documentation and handed him a folder containing detailed records of our entire response effort. This contains a complete timeline of the incident, including our internal recovery attempts, the specific procedures we were unable to perform due to lack of training, and the cost analysis comparing consultant fees to the rejected training budget. Sullivan opened the folder and began reading with the expression of someone discovering evidence of their own profound miscalculation. The documentation was thorough and damning, showing exactly how his budget decision had created a crisis that cost nearly 4 times the amount he'd tried to save. This is very detailed, he said finally. I believe in thorough documentation, I replied, especially when dealing with situations that could have been prevented through proper preparation and training. The consultants worked through the night, gradually reconstructing our database from backup files and recovering corrupted data through specialized techniques that our team had never seen before. I watched them work with a mixture of professional admiration and bitter frustration, knowing that these were exactly the skills that the rejected training would have provided. By noon on Friday, our systems were back online with minimal data loss. The consultants had performed what amounted to digital surgery, carefully extracting corrupted data and reconstructing damaged files through procedures that were both elegant and complex. The total cost was $87,000, not including the productivity losses and client impact from the extended downtime. Sullivan called me into his office that afternoon for what he described as a post-incident review. The meeting felt like a funeral, with Sullivan playing the role of both grieving relative and reluctant executor of his own professional will. "Diana, I want to review our response to this incident and discuss lessons learned," he began, though his tone suggested he already knew what those lessons would be. "I think the lessons are fairly clear," I replied, pulling out another folder filled with documentation. This incident could have been prevented through proper training and preparation. The cost of the rejected training was $22,000. The cost of the emergency response was $87,000. The additional costs in lost productivity and client impact bring the total to over $120,000. Sullivan reviewed the documentation with the expression of someone reading their own obituary. "You believe the training would have prevented this situation?" "I believe the training would have provided the expertise needed to handle this situation internally, at a fraction of the cost and with significantly less risk," I said. "The consultants used techniques that were specifically covered in the training curriculum I proposed." "I see." Sullivan set down the folder and looked out his window at the city skyline, perhaps contemplating the view from his office while he still had one. "Going forward, what do you recommend to prevent similar incidents?" "I recommend approving the training budget immediately," I said. "I also recommend conducting a comprehensive review of our infrastructure and implementing a proactive maintenance program to address potential failure points before they become critical." "And the cost of these recommendations?" "The training budget is $22,000. The infrastructure review and maintenance program would cost approximately $50,000 over the next fiscal year. The total investment of $72,000 would provide long-term protection against incidents that could cost hundreds of thousands to resolve." Sullivan nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding the relationship between preventive investment and crisis management. "I'll approve the training budget immediately. Please resubmit your proposal with updated curriculum information and registration details." "I'll have that information to you by Monday morning," I replied. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already accepted a position at another company. 2 weeks after the database crisis, I received an offer from Quantum Solutions, a technology firm that specialized in advanced infrastructure management. The offer included a significant salary increase, comprehensive training budget, and the kind of technical challenges that excited rather than terrified me. My resignation letter was brief and professional, expressing gratitude for the learning opportunities and wishing the company success in its future endeavors. I provided 3 weeks' notice and offered to help train my replacement, though I suspected it would take considerably longer than 3 weeks to find someone willing to work with Sullivan's management philosophy. Sullivan's response to my resignation was predictably focused on the inconvenience to his department, rather than the underlying issues that had prompted my departure. He scheduled a meeting to discuss retention incentives and counteroffers, apparently believing that the problem was compensation rather than fundamental disagreements about professional development and infrastructure management. "Diana, I'm disappointed that you're leaving, just as we're implementing the training programs you requested," he said during our final meeting. "I'd like to discuss what we can do to convince you to stay." "I appreciate the offer," I replied, "but I've already accepted another position." The decision wasn't based on compensation or training availability. It was based on fundamental differences in how we approach technical problem-solving and professional development. "I don't understand. We're approving your training budget and implementing your infrastructure recommendations. Isn't that what you wanted?" "Those changes are certainly positive," I said, "but they're reactive responses to a crisis that should have been prevented. I'm looking for an organization that invests in capabilities before problems occur, not after they become expensive emergencies." Sullivan's expression suggested that he was beginning to understand the deeper implications of the situation. You're saying that our approach to IT management is fundamentally flawed? I'm saying that our approaches to IT management are fundamentally incompatible, I replied diplomatically. You focus on cost control and reactive solutions. I focus on preventive investment and proactive problem solving. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but they don't work well together. My last day at Meridian Technologies was surprisingly emotional. Marcus, Jennifer, and Tommy had become more than colleagues. They were fellow survivors of a shared technical apocalypse. We'd spent years together in the digital trenches, fixing impossible problems and preventing disasters that management never knew had threatened. Are you sure about this? Jennifer asked as we packed up my desk. Sullivan's actually approved the training budget and infrastructure upgrades. Maybe things will be different now. Things will be different, I agreed. But Sullivan's fundamental approach to management won't change. He'll support training and infrastructure investment until the next budget crisis, and then we'll be back to the same situation. Marcus nodded grimly. The crisis management cycle: invest during emergencies, cut costs during stability, repeat until the next emergency. Exactly. I'm looking for a place where technical expertise is valued before disasters strike, not after they're resolved. Tommy looked up from his workstation with the expression of someone who'd just realized that his mentor was abandoning him to face future crises alone. What if something like this happens again? What if we need someone with your experience to handle the next emergency? You'll handle it, I said with more confidence than I felt. You've learned more about crisis management in the past month than most people learn in years. Besides, with the new training budget and infrastructure improvements, hopefully you won't face situations like this again. My farewell email to the department was carefully crafted to be professional and positive, thanking everyone for their collaboration and expressing confidence in the team's future success. I didn't mention the underlying problems that had prompted my departure, focusing instead on the growth opportunities at my new position. Sullivan's response was a brief note wishing me success and requesting that I remain available for consultation if needed. The request was reasonable, and I agreed to provide limited support during the transition period, though I suspected that my replacement would quickly discover the same fundamental challenges that had led to my departure. 6 months later, I received a LinkedIn message from Marcus that contained a single sentence. The database server crashed again, and they're bringing in consultants. The message was accompanied by a news article about Meridian Technologies' recent system outage, which had lasted 36 hours and resulted in significant client losses. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness reading the article. Satisfaction because the situation validated my concerns about Sullivan's management approach. Sadness because I knew the technical team was dealing with another crisis that proper preparation could have prevented. My new position at Quantum Solutions provided exactly the kind of professional environment I'd been seeking. The company invested heavily in employee training, maintained cutting-edge infrastructure, and approached technical challenges with the kind of proactive planning that made crisis management unnecessary. I was working on advanced cloud architecture projects, implementing sophisticated monitoring systems, and developing disaster recovery procedures that would actually prevent disasters rather than simply respond to them. The contrast with my previous position was striking. Instead of fighting daily battles with aging equipment and inadequate resources, I was designing elegant solutions to complex technical problems. Instead of documenting failures and justifying basic maintenance, I was presenting innovation proposals and receiving approval for ambitious infrastructure upgrades. During my first performance review at Quantum Solutions, my manager asked about my experience with crisis management and emergency response procedures. I described the database recovery incident at Meridian Technologies, focusing on the technical challenges and solution approaches rather than the management failures that had created the crisis. That sounds like a complex situation, she said. How did you handle the pressure of managing a critical system failure while dealing with budget constraints and limited resources? I focused on documentation and communication, I replied. When you're working with inadequate resources, the most important thing is to create a clear record of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what resources would be needed for optimal results. That's a very professional approach. Many people would have been tempted to point fingers or assign blame in that situation. Blame doesn't fix databases, I said. My job was to solve technical problems, not to manage personalities or proof points. The documentation spoke for itself. What I didn't mention was that the documentation had been strategically designed to demonstrate the consequences of poor decision-making without explicitly criticizing anyone. The facts were damning enough without editorial commentary. And professional restraint had been more effective than angry accusations would have been. A year after leaving Meridian Technologies, I learned that Sullivan had been replaced as IT director following a series of system failures and budget overruns. The new director had implemented many of the infrastructure improvements I'd recommended, along with comprehensive training programs and proactive maintenance procedures. The company had stabilized its technical operations. Though the transition had been expensive and disruptive, I felt no satisfaction in Sullivan's professional difficulties. He'd made decisions based on his understanding of business priorities and resource constraints, even if those decisions had ultimately proven counterproductive. The real lesson wasn't about individual failure, but about the importance of matching management philosophy with technical requirements. My career at Quantum Solutions continued to flourish. I was promoted to senior infrastructure architect within 18 months, leading a team of specialists who designed and implemented advanced technical solutions for Fortune 500 clients. The position combined strategic planning with hands-on technical work, exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn me to the technology field originally. The training budget at Quantum Solutions was substantial and enthusiastically supported by management. I attended advanced certification programs, industry conferences, and specialized workshops that kept me current with emerging technologies and best practices. The company understood that technical expertise was an investment rather than an expense, and they budgeted accordingly. Looking back on the incident that had changed my career trajectory, I realized that Sullivan's budget rejection had ultimately done me a favor. The crisis had forced me to confront the fundamental incompatibility between his management style and my professional values. Without that catalyst, I might have remained at Meridian Technologies for years, gradually becoming more frustrated with the limitations and constraints of reactive management. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about professional communication and strategic documentation. When dealing with management decisions that seemed problematic, the most effective approach was to present facts clearly and let the consequences speak for themselves. Emotional arguments and personal criticisms were less persuasive than objective analysis and professional restraint. Most importantly, the incident had reinforced my belief that technical expertise requires ongoing investment and development. Technology evolves rapidly, and the skills that were adequate 5 years ago may be insufficient for today's challenges. Organizations that treat training as an optional expense rather than a strategic necessity will inevitably face crises that could have been prevented through proper preparation. The database recovery crisis at Meridian Technologies had been expensive and disruptive, but it had also been educational. Everyone involved had learned something about the relationship between preparation and performance, investment and results, proactive planning and reactive crisis management. The lessons had been costly, but they'd been thorough and memorable. As I settled into my new role at Quantum Solutions, I occasionally wondered what would have happened if Sullivan had approved the original training budget. Would I have stayed at Meridian Technologies? Would the database crisis have been prevented? Would our professional relationship have evolved into something more constructive? The questions were academic. Of course, the past had already been written, and the future was full of new challenges and opportunities. I was working with cutting-edge technology, leading talented teams, and solving complex problems that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The contrast with my previous position was stark and satisfying. But sometimes, late at night while reviewing system logs or debugging complex network issues, I would remember the sound of those aging servers humming in Meridian's basement. There was something oddly nostalgic about the controlled chaos of that environment, where every day brought new challenges and creative solutions were born from necessity rather than abundance. The technical team I'd left behind had eventually stabilized under new leadership. though not without significant growing pains. Jennifer had been promoted to lead the security division, bringing her paranoid attention to detail and encyclopedic knowledge of threat vectors to a role where those qualities were finally appreciated. Marcus had transitioned to a database architecture position, where his ability to predict system failures 3 days in advance was treated as a valuable skill rather than an annoying quirk. Tommy had surprised everyone by developing into an exceptional crisis manager, his natural optimism and fresh perspective proving invaluable during the transition period. He'd completed several advanced certifications and was now leading the infrastructure modernization project that should have been implemented years earlier. His enthusiasm had evolved into expertise, and his belief that every problem had a solution had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The new IT director, Patricia Vance, had arrived with a mandate to transform the department from a reactive crisis management team into a proactive infrastructure organization. She'd implemented many of the changes I'd recommended, including comprehensive training programs, regular system audits, and a substantial budget for preventive maintenance. The transformation had been expensive but necessary, and the results were already visible in improved system reliability and reduced emergency incidents. I learned these details through industry networking events and professional conferences, where former colleagues would provide updates on Meridian's progress. The conversations were always cordial, though tinged with the slightly awkward dynamic of people who'd shared professional trauma and moved on to different circumstances. At one such conference, I encountered Sullivan himself, who was now working as a consultant for small technology firms. The meeting was brief and professional, focused on industry trends and mutual acquaintances rather than our shared history. He looked older and perhaps wiser, with the slightly worn expression of someone who'd learned difficult lessons about the relationship between management theory and practical implementation. "Diana, good to see you," he said with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I've been following your career at Quantum Solutions. Impressive work on the cloud architecture project." "Thank you," I replied. "I heard about the improvements at Meridian. It sounds like Patricia has implemented some significant changes." "She has," he acknowledged. "The transition was challenging, but necessary. I learned some valuable lessons about the importance of investing in capabilities before problems arise. There was a moment of shared understanding, the kind of professional recognition that comes from surviving mutual mistakes and emerging with new perspectives. Neither of us mentioned the database crisis or the budget rejection that had triggered my departure. Those events had become part of our professional history, lessons learned rather than grievances to be relitigated. "Are you enjoying the consulting work?" I asked. "It's different," he said. "I'm working with smaller companies now, helping them avoid some of the mistakes I made at Meridian. There's something satisfying about sharing hard-won wisdom with people who can actually benefit from it." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it provided closure to a chapter of my career that had ended abruptly and somewhat bitterly. Sullivan had clearly evolved from the experience, developing a more nuanced understanding of technical management and the importance of proactive investment. His consulting work was apparently focused on helping other organizations avoid the kind of crisis that had defined our professional relationship. Back at Quantum Solutions, I found myself applying lessons from the Meridian experience in unexpected ways. When junior team members presented budget proposals or training requests, I made sure to evaluate them based on potential value rather than immediate cost. When system issues arose, I focused on root cause analysis and preventive solutions rather than quick fixes that might create future problems. The database crisis had taught me that technical expertise without organizational support was ultimately futile. But it had also demonstrated the importance of professional documentation and strategic communication. When facing difficult management decisions, facts presented clearly and objectively were more persuasive than emotional arguments or personal criticisms. I'd also learned to recognize the signs of organizational dysfunction early, before they became career-limiting factors. Poor communication, inadequate resource allocation, and reactive management styles were warning signs that indicated deeper problems with organizational culture and strategic planning. The ability to identify these issues early had become a valuable professional skill. My team at Quantum Solutions included several junior specialists who reminded me of Tommy in his early days at Meridian: enthusiastic, optimistic, and eager to learn. I found myself mentoring them with particular attention to crisis management skills and professional communication techniques. They would hopefully never face the kind of situation that had defined my experience at Meridian, but the skills would be valuable regardless of the circumstances. One of these junior specialists, Kevin Park, had recently completed his first major project implementation and was preparing a presentation for senior management. His technical work was excellent, but his presentation skills needed development. I spent an afternoon helping him refine his approach, focusing on clear communication and strategic documentation. The key is to present information in a way that allows people to reach their own conclusions, I explained. Don't tell them what to think. Show them the facts and let them draw their own inferences. But what if they draw the wrong conclusions? Kevin asked. Then you present additional facts that guide them toward better conclusions. The goal is to build understanding, not to win arguments. Kevin's presentation was successful, resulting in approval for additional resources and expanded project scope. More importantly, he'd learned to communicate technical information in ways that non-technical audiences could understand and appreciate. The skill would serve him well throughout his career, regardless of the specific challenges he faced. The incident at Meridian had occurred almost 2 years earlier, but its lessons continued to influence my professional development. I'd learned that technical expertise was necessary but not sufficient for career success. It had to be combined with strategic thinking, effective communication, and the ability to work within organizational constraints. I'd also learned that sometimes the best response to professional frustration was patient persistence rather than immediate confrontation. The documentation I'd created during the database crisis had been more effective than any angry email or confrontational meeting would have been. Facts spoke louder than accusations, and professional restraint had been more powerful than emotional outbursts. Most importantly, I'd learned to recognize when organizational culture was fundamentally incompatible with professional values. The decision to leave Meridian had been difficult, but it had ultimately led to better opportunities and more satisfying work. Sometimes the most professional response to an impossible situation was to find a better situation. The technology industry was full of Sullivan-like managers who focused on cost control rather than capability building. And there would always be organizations that treated technical expertise as a commodity rather than a strategic asset. The key was to find organizations that understood the value of proactive investment and professional development. Quantum Solutions had provided exactly that kind of environment. The company invested heavily in employee training, maintained cutting-edge infrastructure, and approached technical challenges with the kind of strategic planning that made crisis management unnecessary. I was working on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, with resources and support that made success achievable rather than miraculous. The contrast with my previous position was stark and ongoing. Instead of fighting daily battles with aging equipment and inadequate resources, I was designing elegant solutions to complex problems. Instead of documenting failures and justifying basic maintenance, I was presenting innovation proposals and receiving approval for ambitious infrastructure upgrades. The database crisis at Meridian Technologies had been expensive and disruptive, but it had also been educational for everyone involved. Sullivan had learned about the importance of proactive investment. I had learned about professional communication and strategic documentation. And the technical team had learned about crisis management and organizational resilience. The lessons had been costly, but they had been thorough and memorable. Everyone involved had emerged with a better understanding of the relationship between preparation and performance, investment and results, proactive planning and reactive crisis management. As I continued to build my career at Quantum Solutions, I occasionally reflected on the path that had brought me there. The budget rejection that had seemed so frustrating at the time had ultimately led to better opportunities and more satisfying work. Sullivan's short-sighted decision had inadvertently done me a favor, forcing me to confront the limitations of reactive management and seek organizations that valued technical expertise. The experience had also reinforced my belief that professional success required more than technical competence. It required strategic thinking, effective communication, and the ability to work within organizational constraints while maintaining professional integrity. These skills were valuable regardless of the specific technical challenges involved. Looking forward, I was excited about the opportunities that lay ahead. The technology industry was evolving rapidly, creating new challenges and possibilities that would require ongoing learning and adaptation. I was working with talented colleagues on cutting-edge projects, with the resources and support necessary to achieve ambitious goals. The database crisis at Meridian Technologies had been a defining moment in my career, but it was now part of the past. The lessons learned had been valuable, but the future was full of new challenges and opportunities that would require all the skills I developed through years of technical work and professional growth. In the end, the most important lesson from the entire experience was that professional success required both technical expertise and strategic thinking. The ability to solve complex problems was necessary but not sufficient. It had to be combined with effective communication, organizational awareness, and the wisdom to recognize when circumstances required change rather than persistence. The budget rejection that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately led to better opportunities and more satisfying work. Sometimes the most professional response to an impossible situation was to find a better situation. And the skills developed in overcoming challenges were often more valuable than the immediate solutions achieved. As I settled into my role at Quantum Solutions and looked toward future opportunities, I carried with me the lessons learned from that database crisis and the satisfaction of knowing that I'd handled a difficult situation with professional integrity and strategic thinking. The experience had been educational, transformative, and ultimately beneficial. Even if the path had been longer and more complex than originally anticipated,